From Southern Kentucky Festival of Books, this is David Lee, and I'm here for Outside the Book. Our first author this morning is Michael Moreci, who is the author of Black Star Renegades, his first novel, and coming off a long career that a lot of folks would envy as a comic book writer. So, Michael, maybe we might start by talking a little bit about that. How did you get involved in writing for comics?
It's always been a passion of mine. I've been a reader since I was a kid of books and comics, and like anything, I think in entertainment, you start doing something just by doing it. And I started making comics, I was making my own, and I got published in smaller places, and the smaller place led to a bigger place and a bigger place, till eventually, about a decade later, I started writing, gotten my opportunity to do something I always wanted to do, which is write superhero books, and I write currently for DC.
Sounds very exciting, and I suspect a lot of folks would be envious of that kind of career trajectory.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's been great. I've been lucky.
Black Star Renegades is your first novel.
Yes.
What prompted you to go in the direction of novel writing?
That's a great question. So it's something like comics I always wanted to do. I have a ambitious appetite for storytelling, and I want to, tell comics. I like telling novels, and something I always wanted to do. And I had been in contact with an editor at St. Martin's Press. His name is Mark, who's ultimately the editor on that book. Mm-hmm. And I had been pitching him actually for years with no luck. And he contacted me one day, and he knew how much I love Star Wars. And he's like, "Look, I know you've been pitching for a while. Star Wars is something you love. This type of story is something you love. Pitch me something like that." And just everything clicked, and he knew it was something I wanted to do, and he knew this is what I was passionate about, and I put those pieces together and finally sent him a pitch that worked, and we were off and running.
Who's kind of your target audience with this book? Who do you expect is really going to be particularly interested in picking it up?
It's, again, I go for, the touchstone is Star Wars, and Star Wars is something that, I think transcends age in a way, like Star Wars. Kids watch Star Wars, and adults watch Star Wars. Everybody watches Star Wars, and I think that's sort of Black Star Renegades. Not that I expect everyone to read it. I'd love that. But I think it's something that, kids 12 and up, and it's found a great audience in there, 12 and up, but also adults like myself can pick it up and enjoy it as well for a good, fun space adventure.
How would you explain the popularity of young adult literature? I mean, it really has taken off in recent years.
Yeah, no, it has, and it's wonderful. I think it's a mixture of teenagers read a lot. They're great readers. They're enthusiastic and passionate readers. But it's also young adult are books that speak to them in a specific way. They're these great coming of age tales, and they're not afraid to go and touch on darker themes and complicated themes, and they never really talk down to their audience. These books respect their audiences, and they do it in an intriguing and compelling and dynamic way. They're great genre stories of fantasy and sci-fi, and I think you blend those things together and you have a great combination that obviously with the popularity of YA speaks to a lot of people, not just teens, but adults too. I mean, I read YA all the time.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about your work schedule. Do you write every day? Do you write in the mornings? Do you write for X number of hours? Do you try to generate X number of words? How do you discipline yourself to create?
I have a full dance cart because I'm doing novels and I'm doing comics at the same time. So my schedule is write all the time. But no, I mean, realistically, I also have two young boys at home, and I take care of them a lot because my wife works as well, and my mornings are dedicated to them in school and all that kind of stuff, getting them ready. And then when I have my free time, it's off to the races. There's a great quote. You talk about the whole idea of inspiration, and you talk about M. Somerset Maugham said, "I write when inspiration strikes, and it strikes every morning at 9 a.m. sharp." And, that's my philosophy. I write, I have my schedule, and I stay disciplined, and I write when I have my opportunities, and I just can't sit around and waiting for the inspiration to come. You have to come to inspiration, and I do that almost every day.
Well, one of the great things about the folks who created Star Wars is that it opened out to a multi-volume experience, multi-movie experience. What about Black Star Renegades? Is this the first of many?
Well, it's the first, according to my contract, it's the first of at least two. And the second book is I just finished it recently. It comes out in February of 2019. So we're almost there for the second book, which seems so fast. And hopefully, if it's successful, then we'll do more. I have more planned that I would love to do. So we'll see what happens. My fingers are crossed.
Sounds wonderful, and it's a promising book. It's an exciting read, and I hope it does as well as Star Wars.
Oh, me too. Thank you so much.
Michael Moreci, Black Star Renegades, thanks for joining us on Outside the Book. Joining us now on Outside the Book is Jessica Young. She's produced a number of things, but maybe most famously, My Blue is Happy. And her two books, Play the Book and Pet the Book, are in production and will be out very soon. Jessica's been a teacher for 20 years. She's a native of Canada, but she lives now in Nashville, Tennessee. And she says that when she was a child, she wanted to be a tap dancing flight attendant veterinarian. I think somebody who's got something like that to say is probably a Cracker Jack writer. So Jessica, it's great to have you with us on Outside the Book.
Much. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So how did you make a transition from being a tap dancing flight attendant veterinarian to being a writer of children's books?
Yeah, so that was my first aspiration that I can remember wanting to be, was a combination of all of those things. However, the job prospects were few, as you can imagine. So I actually didn't know I wanted to be an author at all until I had my first child, and he's 14 now. But I did always love creativity and doing things that were creative. So I love dance and music and art, and my undergraduate degree is actually in art and psychology. So I was a teacher. I became an art teacher after that, and I was an expressive therapist actually in there for a couple of years too, helping kids through art. And after doing that, I had my first child and fell in love with picture books as an adult because I hadn't really seen them since I was a child.
So what was it about having the child that nudged you toward writing? You saw books and were intrigued by those, or was it something about the experience of parenting, or what was it?
That's a great question. I don't know if I can isolate it really, but I think it was both. I think the feeling of that combination of images and text, and I really do feel like the books are for parents as well. I think they help us slow down. I think they help us sort of focus in the moment with our child and be calm and have a wonderful, like a positive experience, whether it's laughing and being goofy or whether it's a bedtime experience where we're trying to settle down and put them to bed. So I think I just hadn't noticed them until I had my child, and when I did, it was a really touching thing, you know, to really appreciate them.
When it's time for you to write, do you think about your quote-unquote audience? And if you do, are you thinking about the child? Are you thinking about the parent? Because you do have an interesting kind of audience situation here in the sense that 4-year-olds are not going to go out and buy your book.
Right.
But it has
right.
to appeal to a 4-year-old.
Right.
So how do you do that?
That's interesting. Yeah, a lot of it is actually play. It is hard work, and I definitely, during the revision process especially, I'm pushing words around, and it's like a Rubik's Cube to me. It's challenging, but it's fun. But when I'm actually in the first draft and I'm being creative, it is like play to me. And so I really try to focus on, it's a lot of memory for me, like what was I like at that age, and honestly just having fun and playing with concepts and words. I think being a teacher for a long time though does inform, you know, my perspective on that, so I can't really separate it, but but the initial impulse for me is playing and having fun with the ideas and concepts and words, and then from there going back maybe and having more of a deliberate thoughts about the audience, if that makes sense.
When you say initial draft, how many drafts are we talking about here? How many
I'm
drafts
so glad
does it
you
take
asked
to...
that. Yeah, so like it depends on the book, of course, but I revise a lot. Like my first book, My Blue is Happy, picture book, I have 89 versions that are significantly different from each other that I have saved on my computer. So when I do school visits for kids, I always tell them, you know, every author I know, revision is a huge part of that process. And at first, I didn't really understand that myself. And now that I do, I actually really like it. Like I like that part of the process. It's a different part of my brain maybe, and a different process than the initial creation, but I like them both.
Just to make sure I got you correctly, roughly 89 drafts.
Of that picture book, that's about 300 words, yeah.
Wow. That's that's pretty thorough.
It's a lot, and that was a tough one because it was a concept book and it was really hard to figure out, and it had a lot of images that related to colors, and so I really had to rethink them many times. I also talked to kids about working on a team because I see bookmaking as a team sport. So there's input, you have your editor, you have the art director, you have your illustrator and yourself, and then you have the marketing team and the other people at the publishing house. So I love that part of it, and that also is, you have to be able to work on a team.
Particularly as somebody who used to teach art, could you talk a little bit about your work with your illustrator? And I say that particularly because with children's books, the art is especially important.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
how do you collaborate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting because usually the process works that the author, will come up with a concept and will write the text, and that is sold separately to the publisher, and then the illustrator is brought along and completes that process and brings it to life. And every illustrator that I've had, I've been incredibly fortunate because it's like getting the biggest gift in the world to see your book for the first time and see those images. And especially as a person who appreciates visual art, because that's what I went to school for, it's just incredible. And they take it to a place where you never could imagine, However, you don't typically get to interact with them during that process. So usually it's very separate, and the illustrator does his or her work separately, and then it's put together with the text. And that's, the editor and art director have so much to bring, and the publishing house at that point too. So that's, again, it's an example of what a team sport it is.
Wow.
Yeah.
Give us a quick introduction to one of your characters, Finley Flowers.
Okay, so Finley, so she is in 3rd and 4th grade in the series. There are 8 books, and the common thread throughout them all is that she's crazy creative and she has a million ideas in her head all the time. So she has what her best friend Henry calls an idea garden in her head, and she's always thinking of things and wanting to do things. And it was really important for me to especially have a female protagonist that, rather than consuming things, was creating things. And so every book is a different setting, or she's making something different, but that she and her friends, that's what they do. So.
And it might be reminiscent of the author as a girl?
A little bit, yeah. I wasn't as productive maybe and had as many works as she does because she's always making things. But I did always like to create things, yes. And my own children as well. I mean, they love to draw and they've always loved to experiment and invent things and make their own businesses and things like that. So yes, I have a lot of material.
Well, it sounds pretty exciting. Jessica Young, the book is My Blue is Happy and Finley Flowers, and Play the Book, Pet the Book.
Yeah, Play this book and Pet this book come out in May, so in a couple weeks.
It's great to have you here on Outside the Book.
Thanks so much. It's been
fun. My pleasure.
Thanks.
Joining us now on Outside the Book is Courtney Stevens. She's got several books, but one in particular is Dress Codes for Small Towns. She's a Kentucky native, she's a youth minister, she's a college professor, she's an Olympic torchbearer, and she's the author of several really significant books for young adults. So Courtney, thanks for joining us here on Outside the Book.
Thank you for letting me be here today. It's amazing.
Okay, I'll bite. I got to ask, how do you get to be an Olympic torchbearer?
You get nominated, which is sort of crazy. And I'd always wanted to be an Olympian when I was a kid. I played softball for 18 years, and so that's the closest I've ever come. But I got to hold the Olympic flame in my hands.
How far did you run?
Oh, it's not super far, like 3 or 4 blocks in Memphis.
Okay.
They run the torch across America. If it's
yes.
It was for Salt Lake, and so I was in Memphis.
That's very cool.
It was very cool. I still have the torch.
In terms of young adult literature, Dress Codes for Small Towns has been a significant success. What got you writing young adult literature in the first place?
Oh, I was a youth minister for years, and you spend any time with students, and it's not hard to understand that they are the next generation of world changers. And it's not a burden to spend time with them, and because they're actively seeing the world and grabbing the world in a brand new way all the time. And I loved that. And so I didn't like set out to write a young adult novel. I set out to write a novel. And because I'd spent so much time with students, the voice that came out of me was this voice that I think it's the voice I admire, you know? And so it happened to be, you know, a 16, 17, 18-year-old.
Well, and particularly as you're creating this book, to what extent, and I'm intrigued that you didn't deliberately set out to write young adult literature.
No.
You set out to write a book that spoke to significant things.
Yeah.
To what extent did you have an audience in mind as you were writing? Or were you writing for your own self?
You know, when I first started writing, I think I was only writing for myself, you know, writing for an audience of one. And like, if I'm the only one who ever read that, it would be enough. But the longer that I've been writing, the more aware I am of the role that the audience plays and how very important readers are. Every reader brings their own stake to a story. And so it's not that like when I'm creating now, I'm like, I wonder what they want. It's more like, what would they find entertaining? What would they find pieces of tension that they'll enjoy? What's the type of drama that pulls us in and changes us? And I'm interested in that. And so I think that, you know, it's both and. I'm always writing for me because I'm going to spend more time with this story than anyone else ever will. But the longer I write, the more I hope I'm invested in the people that will join on this journey with me.
What do you hear from your readers, particularly in the social media age? And you're out promoting your book. You probably you run into folks who have read it.
Oh, of course.
What do they say?
Well, you know, I think that we're in an age when you can't just be a writer. You have to learn the job of being an author.
Yes.
And it is a job. It's presentations and it's school visits and it's amazing festivals like the one we're sitting at right now. And so you do get this like privileged opportunity to interact with your reader in a way that maybe you wouldn't have in a different decade or time. And social media certainly lends itself toward honesty for people to tell you exactly how they feel about your work. But on the whole, this is what I've discovered. The people that reach out to you are reaching out because they've connected in some way. And even if that connection is, I didn't get what I wanted out of this, it's still such a privilege that somebody would be that vulnerable with you and like share a part of, they don't have to do that. Like when you think about how intimidating it might be if I said, you know, why don't you just run out there and talk to 15 strangers? Most of us would kind of like, why do we have to do that, you know? But yet they've done that. They've stepped, you know, into a piece of courage and have come to me. And so I try and honor the courage that it takes to step into that space. And I've, on the whole, encountered people who have been changed by my work.
Wow.
And that they're braver because of it. In fact, I wrote dress codes because I was touring for Faking Normal, my first book. And in many ways, while it has a very serious topic about recovering from sexual abuse, it also is about what it's like to have a secret. And then also what it's like to have people you could trust with that secret and like what it takes to like step over that line and to tell them the truth. And I anticipated people like survivors emailing me and telling me that they read my book and this was their story. And that's happened. I am the recipient of many, many emails from people who have been abused, sharing their story bravely for the first time. But I also found myself at this week in Texas in which students pulled me aside and they said that because they'd read Faking Normal, they'd found the courage to tell their parents X about themselves, or, you know, in particular, a number of students who were struggling with sexual identity. They're like, I need to make my parents and the people I trust part of these decisions. And they'd always been terrified to do that. And so I was getting ready to do my laundry, and all of my shirts from that whole trip were covered in snot and tears. And I thought, I'm not done with those
That's
kids
a
yet.
powerful kind of review.
It was these kids that would pull me aside and tell me their stories and cry on my shoulder. And I thought, I'm not done here. Like, that story's not over. I'm gonna write those kids, those brave kids, a love letter. And dress codes became that love letter.
Courtney, it's a powerful story, and thank you very much for sharing it with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Courtney Stevens on Outside the Book. Joining us now on Outside the Book is Metalli Perkins. Her books include You Bring the Distant Near. Her books have been honored as the most engaging author by Independent Bookseller Association and Literary Light for Children by the Associates of the Boston Public Library. Although she currently resides in San Francisco, she came to the United States when she was 7 years old. And a lot of her story focuses on what it's like to grow up as an immigrant child in the United States. Metalli, thank you very much for being with us on Outside the Book.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a joy to be here.
I am intrigued by the role that you say fire escapes have played in your life. Could you
Right.
talk a little bit about fire escapes?
Yes. So when we arrived in New York City, my parents were originally refugees from what is now Bangladesh, and so they lost everything in the war. They owned a big jute farm, and it was all taken. And so when we arrived in the United States, there was nothing in the bank. So a small little apartment. A lot of people start life out here. Just we had what was in my dad and mom's brains, which was pretty good stuff. But at the start, we lived in a small apartment, and I used to climb out onto the fire escape of that apartment, and I would read out there and write out there. But my mom never found out, so I hope she's not watching this.
So, your work is sometimes, I suppose, characterized as young adult literature.
Yes.
Do you intentionally write young adult literature, or who's the audience that you have in mind when you sit down to write?
Well, my most recent book, You Bring the Distant Near, it's nice, it's being read by grandchild book clubs, and so I write a book that I hope a lot of people will enjoy, but my voice itself is stuck at about age 14. I think that's where I am. That's my voice. I can't get older than that. Also, my mom is still here, so I can't write anything that she'll read that will cause her to feel any kind of shame or dishonor, so I can't write anything steamy in my books. So I think that's another thing. Yeah.
What kind of writing discipline do you follow? Do you write every day?
Gosh, writing discipline, that's an oxymoron for me, because I like deadlines. I just finished a book that was under deadline. My editor and agent have decided that they create deadlines for me, because otherwise I can't. I do the laundry, visit my mom, check my email. So the deadline's important, but I do go to coffee shops. I like writing in coffee shops. I like that background buzz, the coffee shop, so I get inspired by that. And I try to go every day. And I circulate coffee shops, so I'm not the annoying person that takes that chair by the plug every time I circulate.
Do you try to write X number of words a day, or do you just write until it feels like you've done what you need to do that day?
I do try to push through a word count. That helps me. So I set a target word count for the whole entire novel, which is about, for me, for the first draft, about 60,000. So a good working day would be about 3,000 words, at the minimum 1,500. And I just give myself permission to write garbage. As I sit there, I don't move. I just say, all right, 1,500 words. It can just be the worst writing, but just go and do this thing. So that's what I do. I don't even let myself get up to go to the bathroom or get another latte or anything. It's just that 1,500 is essential.
Does your mother ever see any of your drafts?
No, because then she would give me so much advice and tell me that this character should fall in love with that character. She watches a lot of Bengali, that's our culture of origin, soap operas, and then she gets these ideas of novels that I should write from that, so she'll take charge of my plot. Yeah, I keep it secret till she reads it. Yeah.
So,
final draft.
So you came here when you were 7 years old.
Yes.
Could you talk a bit about how the experience for a 7-year-old immigrating to the United States now might be different from the experiences that you had?
Right. When I came, we didn't have any TV at all. As I said, we didn't have much. So the very first month I was here, my sister took me by the hand and walked me to the Flushing Public Library, and she told me that I could take 7 books home, and I was just thrilled. I couldn't believe, I'd never been in a library, and I couldn't believe that I could take 7 books home with me out to that fire escape. And so I started out life here as a reader, and I feel that if an immigrant child arrives here and is able to do that, what I learned was how to code switch really quickly through those books. There weren't a lot of Americans then who were welcoming us in their homes. Maybe that's the same here. There are a few who eventually did, but back then the only way I had access to the culture here was through stories. And so, but the books are a little different than TV and movies, so I feel that the big difference is I was introduced to life as an American through books, and maybe they're getting introduced through the screens. The stories are the same, but I feel what the book allows you to do is imagine another life more powerfully than a story on a screen. And so I was able to do that, to learn the code by living vicariously through my characters that I was meeting. And that really helped me be successful in this culture, as well as I still had the culture of home, because we had a very traditional home. So being able to shift between 2 cultures, that's what an immigrant kid learns, and I feel like that's a big advantage. People always maybe sympathize and feel sorry for us, but I think when you learn to code switch as a child, it lasts you for a lifetime.
Talk a little bit about why you think diversity themes are important in young adult literature.
Yes, well, as I said, I think the power of literature, there was a great quote from C.S. Lewis I just read recently about how he's talked about how literature allows you to live a myriad of lives and never leave your own life. And so it gives you that skill of imagining life in another person's skin. And for those of us who just read or just are monocultural, just have one culture and just read monoculturally, we lose that capacity of learning that our imagination to learn what it's like to live in another person's skin. And if you do that as a child or as a young adult, that is a capacity you develop for your entire life. And then when you hear someone else's story, you can really imagine all that it is to be in that person's life. Yeah.
Metalli Perkins, you bring the distance near.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Metalli Perkins has joined us on Outside the Book, and for Outside the Book here at the Southern Kentucky Festival of Books, I'm David Lee. Thanks for being a part of this.